The war in the Middle East reached a shocking turning point when American stealth bombers suddenly appeared over Iran in the early hours of March 1st. Only days earlier, Iran had attempted to retaliate against massive United States and Israeli strikes by launching waves of missiles and drones at American bases across the region. Explosions were reported near facilities in Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. According to reporting cited by France 24 and other international outlets, most of those missiles were intercepted, but the attacks confirmed one thing clearly. The conflict had entered a dangerous new phase. Iran's leadership believed it could project strength by targeting American bases across the Middle East. Instead, those strikes triggered a devastating response. Within hours, the United States activated one of the most powerful aircraft in its arsenal, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. These aircraft did not launch from nearby bases in the Middle East. Instead, they departed from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, thousands of miles away. Each mission required a round trip lasting more than 30 hours, supported by multiple aerial refueling operations conducted by KC-135 Stratotanker aircraft. According to military reporting referenced by the War Zone, several B-2 bombers entered Iranian airspace before dawn, flying at high altitude and using stealth technology designed to evade radar detection. Iran's air defenses were already under pressure after earlier strikes by American and Israeli forces. Many radar sites had been damaged or destroyed, and fighter aircraft were operating under severe constraints. That environment created a narrow but decisive window for the United States to carry out a precision strike against one of Iran's most important military assets, its underground missile infrastructure. Iran had spent years building hardened missile facilities deep inside mountains. These installations were often referred to as missile caves. They served both as storage sites and as launch platforms for ballistic missiles capable of reaching targets across the Middle East. According to analysis cited by the New York Times and defense researchers, Iran had accumulated more than 3,000 missiles and had ambitions to expand that arsenal significantly over the coming years. But the missile caves had a critical weakness. Many of the tunnels were built with exposed storage areas and limited blast protection. If the entrance's launch apertures or ventilation shafts were destroyed, the entire facility could become unusable. Analysts noted that a carefully planned strike could seal the tunnels without even destroying the entire complex. This is where the B-2 bomber became essential. The aircraft's stealth design allows it to penetrate heavily defended airspace and strike targets that other aircraft cannot reach. Each bomber can carry a large number of precision-guided bombs, including bunker-penetrating weapons designed to destroy hardened underground facilities. According to military aviation experts cited in defense analysis, reports a single B-2 can deliver enough firepower in one pass to disable an entire missile complex. That capability made it the perfect platform for the mission unfolding over Iran. As the bombers approached their targets, the strategy was simple but devastating. Rather than attempting to destroy every missile hidden underground, the goal was to trap them. By collapsing tunnel entrances and launch shafts, the United States could effectively neutralize large portions of Iran's missile force without needing to locate every individual weapon. Satellite imagery, released shortly after the strike, suggested that several missile bases had suffered severe structural damage. One of the most significant targets was reportedly located near Tabriz in northern Iran, where collapsed tunnel entrances were visible from space. Analysts say that damage of this type can take months or even years to repair. For Iran, the implications were immediate and severe. Ballistic missiles had long been considered the backbone of the country's military deterrent. They were the primary tool Iran relied upon to threaten regional adversaries and to respond to foreign military pressure. If those missile launch sites were disabled, Iran's ability to retaliate would be dramatically reduced. And that appears to have been exactly what the B-2 mission was designed to accomplish. Yet this strike was only the beginning of a much larger strategy. Behind the scenes, American carrier strike groups were already positioned in the Persian Gulf. Fighter jets, surveillance aircraft, and electronic warfare platforms were preparing for follow-on operations that could dramatically increase the pace of attacks against Iranian military infrastructure. In other words, the stealth bombers were not simply delivering punishment. They were clearing the path for the next stage of the war. But the real shock came after the bombing run was complete, when satellite images and intelligence reports began revealing the scale of the damage inside Iran's missile network. What exactly did the B-2 bombers destroy during that mission, and how badly has it weakened Iran's ability to fight back? That answer begins to emerge in the next phase of the story. When the American B-2 bombers crossed into Iranian airspace, their mission was not simply to drop bombs and leave. The operation had been designed with a very specific strategic objective. The goal was to dismantle the backbone of Iran's missile threat without triggering an uncontrolled escalation across the entire region. Iran's missile program has long been the centerpiece of its military doctrine. Unlike larger global powers, Iran does not rely on a massive air force or large fleets of advanced bombers. Instead, it invested heavily in ballistic missiles capable of striking targets across the Middle East. According to assessments referenced by the New York Times and international defense analysts, Iran has accumulated more than 3,000 missiles of varying ranges. Some systems, such as the Sijil and Khorramshahr missiles, are capable of reaching targets more than 2,000 kilometers away. These weapons gave Iran the ability to threaten U.S. military bases, shipping routes in the Persian Gulf, and key allies such as Israel. Even when Iran could not match Western air power, its missile arsenal remained a powerful deterrent. That is precisely why the United States focused its first stealth bomber strikes on missile storage and launch infrastructure. Military analysts cited by the War Zone explained that the missile caves were not simply warehouses. Many of these underground complexes had built-in launch apertures that allowed missiles to be fired directly from inside the mountain. This design allowed Iran to protect its weapons from airstrikes while maintaining the ability to launch them quickly. However, the same design also created vulnerabilities. The entrances, ventilation shafts, and launch fissures were critical points in the structure. If those narrow openings were destroyed or sealed, the entire underground complex could become unusable. Missiles might still exist inside the tunnels, but they could not be launched. This is where the B-2 bomber's precision strike capability became decisive. Instead of dropping enormous bunker-buster weapons intended to destroy entire mountains, the aircraft likely deployed precision-guided bombs designed to penetrate hardened surfaces and collapse key structural points. Reports from the U.S. Central Command indicated that the bombers were equipped with 2,000-pound class precision weapons, which are capable of penetrating reinforced concrete before detonating. These bombs were powerful enough to destroy tunnel entrances and critical launch infrastructure while minimizing the number of strikes needed. Satellite images released after the operation appeared to confirm the effectiveness of this approach. Several missile facilities showed collapsed tunnel entrances and significant surface damage. Defense analysts pointed out that repairing these entrances is not a simple task. Clearing tons of rock and rebuilding reinforced access points can take months or even years. For Iran, that damage could immediately limit its ability to launch ballistic missiles at regional targets. Another factor made the strike even more significant. Intelligence reports suggested that some of the caves stored missiles in open staging areas without strong internal blast protection. If one missile detonated during a strike, it could trigger a chain reaction that destroyed many more weapons inside the facility. This risk meant that even a limited number of precise strikes could cause catastrophic damage to Iran's missile reserves. Early estimates suggested that multiple missile bases were hit during the B-2 operation. Analysts cited by Newsweek reported damage at locations including Tabriz and several facilities connected to radar and missile operations elsewhere in the country. Additional reports suggested that storage bunkers used for drones and cruise missiles had also been destroyed. The broader impact of these strikes was strategic rather than symbolic. Iran had attempted to retaliate against American bases across the Middle East, hoping to demonstrate that it could still project power. Instead, the response from the United States targeted the very systems that allowed Iran to launch those attacks in the first place. By weakening Iran's missile infrastructure, the United States effectively reduced the biggest threat facing American forces and aircraft carriers operating in the region. And that opened the door for the next stage of the campaign. With Iran's missile network under pressure, American carrier groups and allied aircraft could now operate closer to Iranian territory. That meant faster strike cycles, shorter flight times, and a much higher tempo of air operations. But the B-2 mission may have had another objective as well. One that had nothing to do with missiles and everything to do with the political future of Iran itself. Because as the bombs fell on those missile caves, something even more dramatic was unfolding inside Iran's leadership. And the consequences of that development could reshape the entire war. As the dust settled over several of Iran's missile bases, military analysts began to understand that the B-2 operation was not just a single strike. It was part of a carefully constructed sequence designed to reshape the balance of power in the region. For years, Iran's ballistic missile arsenal served as its primary strategic shield. Even when facing superior American air power, Tehran could still threaten regional bases, shipping routes in the Persian Gulf, and allied infrastructure across the Middle East. That capability forced the United States and its partners to operate cautiously. But the strikes carried out by the B-2 bombers began to erode that shield. According to defense assessments cited by the New York Times and several regional analysts, Iran's missile force depends heavily on fixed launch infrastructure and protected storage facilities. Destroying mobile launchers is difficult because they can move and hide. However, underground complexes and tunnel systems cannot relocate. Once their entrances or launch shafts are destroyed, those facilities effectively become sealed vaults. That is exactly what the B-2 mission targeted. Satellite images released in the days following the strike showed collapsed tunnel entrances at missile installations and visible structural damage around several key launch points. Analysts noted that the entrances to underground missile facilities are often narrow and reinforced. When those points are destroyed, the tunnels behind them can become inaccessible. Even if hundreds of missiles remain stored inside, they are trapped. For Iran's military planners, this creates a serious operational problem. Missile forces rely on rapid deployment and the ability to launch salvos quickly. If access to launch points is restricted or delayed, the entire strategy begins to break down. At the same time, the United States was already positioning additional military assets around Iran. Aircraft carriers operating in the Persian Gulf were maintaining high readiness levels. Carrier-based fighter aircraft such as the F-18 could launch repeated strike missions once Iran's missile threat was weakened. Military analysts pointed out that aircraft carriers must normally operate farther from hostile coastlines when ballistic missiles are active. Once those missiles are suppressed, carriers can move closer and increase the pace of operations dramatically. That appears to be exactly what American planners were preparing to do. Reports from defense commentators suggested that stealth fighters such as the F-22 had likely played a role earlier in the operation by targeting Iranian air defense systems. By removing radar coverage and missile batteries, they created safer corridors through which the B-2 bombers could pass. This layered approach is a hallmark of modern air campaigns. First, air defenses are degraded. Next, strategic infrastructure is targeted. Finally, conventional strike aircraft move in to conduct sustained operations. Israel was also deeply involved in the campaign. Israeli fighter jets and electronic warfare aircraft had already conducted hundreds of strikes across Iran's military infrastructure in coordination with American forces. According to regional defense reporting, Israeli F-35 and F-15 aircraft participated in earlier phases of the operation that hit radar stations, drone depots, and command facilities. Together, these actions created a multi-front aerial campaign that Iran struggled to counter. Iran's leadership had hoped that its retaliatory missile strikes on American bases would deter further escalation. Instead, those attacks triggered a response that focused directly on the core of Iran's military capability. The strategic consequences began to emerge almost immediately. If missile bases are disabled and air defenses weakened, American and allied aircraft gain the ability to operate more freely over Iranian territory. That increases the number of targets that can be struck each day and reduces the time required between missions. In other words, the tempo of the war begins to accelerate. And as the military pressure intensified, another dramatic development was beginning to unfold inside Iran itself. Reports emerging from international media suggested that the country's leadership structure was facing an unexpected and potentially destabilizing crisis. Because while bombs were falling on missile bases, Iran's political system was entering one of the most uncertain moments in its modern history. What happened next would send shockwaves far beyond the battlefield. While American stealth bombers were striking missile infrastructure deep inside Iran, another development began to dominate international headlines. It was not just the destruction of military targets that was alarming observers. It was the sudden uncertainty surrounding Iran's leadership. According to multiple international reports cited by Al Jazeera and other global news trackers, the conflict had already inflicted significant losses across Iran. Early casualty estimates suggested that hundreds of people had been killed as waves of airstrikes hit military facilities, missile bases, and strategic infrastructure across the country. These strikes were part of a broader campaign conducted by the United States and Israel following Iran's missile attacks on American bases throughout the Middle East. But the most dramatic report concerned the fate of Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei. Speculation began circulating after several command facilities and government buildings were targeted in the opening phase of the air campaign. Shortly afterward, Iranian state media confirmed that Khamenei had died during the conflict and announced a national mourning period lasting 40 days. The announcement immediately created shockwaves across the region. The supreme leader had been the central authority of Iran's political and military system for decades. His office held ultimate control over the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the country's strategic military planning, and the broader direction of the Iranian state. With his death confirmed, the country suddenly faced an unprecedented leadership vacuum. Iran's constitution outlines a process for selecting a new supreme leader, but that process requires stability and coordination among powerful political factions. In the middle of an active war, that process becomes far more complicated. Reports from regional analysts indicated that a temporary leadership council had been formed to guide the transition. This interim body reportedly consisted of senior political and religious figures tasked with overseeing the selection of Khamenei's successor. However, the situation remained highly uncertain. The reason was simple. The same military campaign that had weakened Iran's missile capabilities was also targeting the command structure of the regime. American and Israeli airstrikes were hitting military headquarters, radar stations, and facilities connected to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Each new strike risked eliminating additional senior figures who might otherwise have played a role in shaping Iran's next government. This created a dangerous dynamic. As the leadership tried to reorganize itself, the war continued to escalate. Every day brought new reports of airstrikes and additional military targets destroyed. The pressure on Iran's governing system was growing from both the battlefield and the political arena. At the same time, reactions among ordinary Iranians appeared to be deeply divided. State television instructed citizens to observe the official mourning period, but videos circulating on social media suggested a more complex reality. Some people appeared to be celebrating the weakening of the regime, while others expressed fear about what might happen next. Decades of political tension inside the country meant that the future of Iran was far from predictable. International observers quickly warned that the collapse of a central authority could produce several possible outcomes. A controlled leadership transition might stabilize the system. However, there was also the possibility of internal power struggles within the Revolutionary Guard or among competing political factions. For the United States and its allies, this uncertainty added another layer to an already volatile situation. Military planners were continuing their operations against missile infrastructure and air defense networks, but they were also watching closely to see how Iran's political structure would respond to the sudden loss of its most powerful leader. Because if Iran's leadership became fractured while its military infrastructure was under attack, the consequences could extend far beyond the battlefield. And just as this political crisis was unfolding, another international decision was about to change the trajectory of the war even further. A decision that could dramatically increase the reach and intensity of American air operations against Iran. As the situation inside Iran became more unstable, international attention shifted to the growing military coalition forming around the United States. What had begun as a series of retaliatory strikes was rapidly evolving into a broader air campaign aimed at dismantling Iran's ability to continue the conflict. One of the most important developments came from the United Kingdom. In the early stages of the operation, American B-2 bombers had been forced to fly directly from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. This meant each mission required an exhausting journey of more than 30 hours, supported by multiple aerial refueling operations over thousands of miles. According to defense reporting cited by international outlets, that logistical challenge limited how quickly the United States could repeat those long-range strike missions. But that situation was about to change. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced that the United States would be allowed to use several British-controlled bases to support future operations against Iran. Among the most significant facilities mentioned were RAF Fairford in the United Kingdom and the strategic base at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. This decision carried enormous military implications. Diego Garcia sits in a location that allows American bombers to reach the Middle East much more quickly than flights originating from the continental United States. With access to these bases, B-2 bombers could shorten their flight times, reduce the need for mid-air refueling, and conduct more frequent missions against targets inside Iran. Military analysts quickly pointed out that this could dramatically increase the tempo of American air operations. Instead of a limited number of extremely long missions, the United States could begin launching repeated strikes with much shorter turnaround times. That meant Iranian military infrastructure could face sustained pressure day after day. At the same time, American naval forces were already positioned in the region. Aircraft carriers operating in the Persian Gulf were preparing for a higher pace of flight operations now that Iran's missile launch capabilities had been weakened by earlier strikes. Carrier-based aircraft such as the F-18 were capable of launching missions every few minutes during high-intensity operations. Defense observers explained that once Iran's ballistic missile threat is reduced, carriers can safely operate closer to the coastline. That allows strike aircraft to reach their targets faster and return more quickly for rearming and refueling. In practical terms, that means dozens of additional airstrikes can be carried out each day. Israel was also continuing its own air campaign in parallel with the United States. Israeli fighter jets, including F-35 stealth aircraft and advanced electronic warfare platforms, were reported to be striking radar sites, weapons depots, and command facilities across Iran. Together, these combined operations created a continuous wave of air power aimed at degrading Iran's military capabilities. Meanwhile, the United States was also presenting Iran with a diplomatic off-ramp. In an interview reported by Axios, President Donald Trump suggested that Iran still had the opportunity to bring the conflict to an end. He stated that the United States could either continue military operations until Iran's nuclear and missile programs were dismantled or conclude the conflict quickly if Iran agreed to halt those ambitions. The message was clear. Iran faced a choice between continuing a war that was steadily eroding its military power or negotiating an end to the conflict before the situation worsened further. Yet at that moment, the war was still unfolding in real time. American bombers had struck missile caves. Israeli aircraft were targeting military infrastructure. Aircraft carriers were preparing to launch even more operations. And Iran was struggling to reorganize its leadership while under intense military pressure. All of these events pointed toward a single question that analysts across the world were beginning to ask. Was this campaign simply intended to weaken Iran's military capabilities, or was it the opening phase of something far larger that could reshape the entire region? The answer to that question may determine what happens next in one of the most dangerous conflicts the Middle East has faced in decades. As the first wave of B-2 bombing missions concluded and new intelligence reports began to emerge, a clearer picture of the conflict started to take shape. The strikes carried out by the United States and its allies were not random acts of retaliation. They formed part of a carefully designed strategy intended to dismantle the core military capabilities that Iran relied upon to project power across the Middle East. The destruction of missile infrastructure was the central objective. For decades, Iran had invested heavily in ballistic missiles as a way to compensate for weaknesses in its air force. These missiles allowed the country to threaten American bases, regional rivals, and international shipping routes, even when Iranian aircraft could not compete with Western technology. According to assessments referenced by the New York Times and several defense research organizations, thousands of missiles were believed to be stored across Iran's network of underground facilities. But those underground systems depended on access points that could be targeted. The B-2 strike exploited that vulnerability. By collapsing entrances to missile tunnels and destroying launch apertures, the operation effectively neutralized many of the launch sites without needing to destroy every missile inside. Analysts say that even limited structural damage can prevent missiles from being transported or fired, turning entire complexes into sealed storage vaults. That shift has immediate strategic consequences. With fewer operational missile launch sites, Iran's ability to threaten American forces and allied countries becomes more limited. This allows aircraft carriers and other strike platforms to move closer to Iranian territory. Once those forces are positioned within shorter striking distance, the pace of air operations can increase dramatically. At the same time, the broader air campaign continues to expand. American and Israeli aircraft are targeting radar systems, weapons depots, and command centers across Iran. Each successful strike weakens the country's ability to coordinate military operations. Defense analysts note that modern air campaigns often unfold in stages. Air defenses are suppressed first, strategic weapons infrastructure is attacked next, and sustained pressure is then applied to command networks and logistics systems. That pattern now appears to be unfolding over Iran. Yet military pressure is only one part of the story. Iran is also facing a moment of deep political uncertainty. The reported death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has created a leadership crisis that could reshape the country's internal power structure. While an interim council has reportedly been formed to guide the selection of a successor, the outcome of that process remains unclear. If Iran's political leadership becomes divided while its military capabilities continue to erode, the balance of power in the region could change dramatically. At the same time, the United States has signaled that the conflict does not have to continue indefinitely. American officials have indicated that Iran could still choose to halt its nuclear and missile ambitions in exchange for an end to the campaign. Whether Tehran accepts that option or continues the confrontation may determine how long this war lasts. What has already become clear is that the B-2 bomber mission marked a pivotal moment. The strike demonstrated that even heavily fortified underground facilities can be targeted when the right aircraft and weapons are used. It also showed how quickly the balance of a conflict can shift when advanced air power is combined with coordinated operations across multiple allies. For viewers trying to understand what is happening in the Middle East, the events of the past few days offer an important lesson. Modern wars are not decided by a single battle. They are shaped by the gradual dismantling of the systems that allow a nation to fight. And in this case, the systems that form the backbone of Iran's military power are now under relentless pressure. The question that remains is the one military analysts and political leaders are asking around the world tonight. Will Iran choose to step back from the edge and negotiate? Or will the next wave of airstrikes push this conflict into an even more dangerous phase? If you want to stay informed as this story continues to develop, make sure to subscribe and follow the channel. More updates and analysis are coming as new information emerges. What do you think will happen next in this rapidly changing conflict?